As al-Qaeda gains momentum across the Arab world and the region's troubles add more fuel to the fury,
the flip side of the failure of the Arab Spring is the rise of al-Qaeda.
what is being done to halt the surge in violence?
We've come to Washington to examine America's response to a resurgent al-Qaeda.
Dow has to be carefully calibrated in each area in which you discover an al-Qaeda presence.
As boots on the ground are replaced by drones in the air,
There are no Americans fighting in Iraq.
with al-Qaeda taking root in Syria and Iraq, can Western powers truly reverse the tide?
We're going to finish the job. We are going to defeat al-Qaeda.
We ask, has the U.S. failed in its war on terror?
Intervention was just colossal. It was an enormous investment, an enormous cost that did not bear fruit.
I am Marwan Bishara, and this is Empire.
The new face of al-Qaeda is the ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham.
God willing, the hope is great. We are building the seed of the state.
Al-Qaeda used to be the threat without an address, operating out of caves. They have graduated from suicide vests and car bombs. Now they're taking control of towns and cities. But they're so oppressive and brutal that other rebel groups have turned against them, creating a civil war within the civil war. The fighting spread, more players got involved.
Now you've seen increasing Iranian influence. You're seeing Maliki persecuting the Sunni minority. And now in Fallujah, there are vehicles driving around with black flags. That is an abject, abysmal failure of Maliki, but also the United States of America.
And that wider war became a religious war between Shiites and Sunnis. There's a push for a diplomatic solution.
A big problem for Geneva Conference is that the national coalition don't really represent anybody inside Syria anymore.
There isn't anyone who's willing to sign a deal that leaves Assad in place. You won't find anyone.
This is a problem of the opposition. They are not reasonable.
Al-NUSRA has rejected all diplomacy.
We will not recognize the results of the Geneva II conference. Who has authorized them to represent the people?
The position of ISIS and al-Qaeda is the same. It's clear and unequivocal. But what is Washington's position? Is it really alarmed by the escalation of violence? Or is it satisfied to see its nemesis killing and weakening each other? I met up with General Michael Hayden, who as director of the National Security Agency and latterly as head of the Central Intelligence Agency, led much of the U.S. counterterrorism efforts. I began by asking him about the state of play in Syria.
The Syrian revolution has been hijacked by Islamist extremists, by al-Qaeda. They've become the controlling element in the opposition, and left unchecked, what we could end up with was a pre-9/11 Afghanistan-like state comprised of Anbar province and the eastern Syrian desert, and unlike Afghanistan.
So what is then the solution as far as America is concerned for Syria?
Well, right now, the ideal solution is to have made different decisions 2 and 3 years ago, to put a Western, even American thumb on the scale to affect the evolution of the conflict.
And America didn't.
It did not intervene when intervention carried less of a tariff, carried less of a bill. To put our thumb on the scale now would require remarkable energy on our part to have that change the battlefield balance in any way.
It didn't even interfere diplomatically and politically and strategically. I'm not speaking militarily.
If you don't back up those kinds of actions with realities on the ground, I think your influence is quite weak, and ours was. And let me add an additional thought. Is this evolution, you know, from autocrats and Democrats to sectarian to proxy to an al-Qaeda
like takeover, as that evolution took place and these new truths became apparent, it was the great misfortune of my country to have that last truth become so apparent in the summer of 2012, which, as you know, is right in the middle of our presidential election year, and very few bold decisions are made in those kinds of years.
Do you mean this was politics? Cynical calculations?
Not cynical. It's just very hard for Americans to turn their attention, the administration to turn its attention to that kind of issue, to make that kind of high-risk decision in the midst of a political season.
General,
here.
when tens of thousands of people die and people then take the expedient road to politics, that is cynical.
Well, I wouldn't attach cynicism to it.
Let me tell you what Syrian opposition leaders that I spoke to recently think. They think there is a certain cynical calculus at play whereby the opposition is supported just enough to stay alive, but not enough to be able to fight seriously the regime.
I would agree with you that that is the effect of current actions collectively, including my own governments. That is the result, and that's a very dark statement. I really don't think that's the intent. But I do think it's clear that's the result.
It seems to me that the cynicism, as far as many Syrians and Arabs are concerned, goes even deeper. They would that this administration would like to see al-Qaeda and the Syrian regime going after each other. Why not? They're both unfriendly to the United States. Let them kill one another and let the Syrians fall between the chairs.
To have Sunni extremists battling with Shia extremists in a fight to the death, in a way that consumes their energy so that they're not focused on other potential enemies or targets, in a very practical, real politics sort of way, is probably not the worst of all possible worlds.
So you actually think that Assad is fighting al-Qaeda and that serves America's interests? It seems to me that, as far as you're concerned, it seems, and as far as this president is concerned, it's safer with Assad than it is with the alternative.
Well, look, looking at the range of possible outcomes, I must reluctantly conclude that of the possible outcomes, Assad winning is not the worst one. We have seen the results of what happens when a regime collapses in Iraq and in Libya, very bad. And so this may be the government without Assad being the American position.
You and apparently this administration think that the person who is morally and politically responsible for the death of tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people should remain in power because that's in America's best interest. That's what you're saying.
Of the range of possible outcomes I see, this situation is so dark, so bad, so much the product of our inaction months and years before, that I reluctantly have to say, I can think of worse outcomes than this regime staying in control. Okay. Marwan, simply what I'm saying is, unless the West, the United States, outside powers are willing to invest massively in this project and create a third way, what we have is a rump Syrian successor state comprised of probably Anbar province in Iraq and the eastern Syrian desert, with al-Qaeda affiliates or al-Qaeda main firmly in control in an area that's at the crossroads of civilization.
Is it practical that the manufacturer of terrorism in that country, in that region, remains in power? I just see it as a pyromaniac strategy. You know, you put off the fire with more fire.
And I'm sorry, we're going to have to reverse roles here. I get to ask the question. So what's your alternative?
General, in this city, maybe you're the general. In this program, I'm the general. Back to the subject of the 400 miles that are now controlled by extremists, al-Qaeda affiliates, the Islamic State, al-NUSRA. This is an end result of your war in Iraq and your lack of action in Syria. Could we at least agree that there's a responsibility there?
Well, look, I will freely admit, all right, that one cannot consider Iraq and Syria as separate. And one of the points I'm beginning to think through now is that those lines drawn after World War I by Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, those lines don't matter the way they used to. And Marwan, at the end of this, we may see those lines go away, and we may see new political alignments in the Middle East. We had a national intelligence estimate in 2006 in which we said that Iraq had become, from al-Qaeda's point of view, the main front in the war against the far enemy, against us. And we actually said in our national intelligence estimate in 2006 that Iraq had become the cause célèbre for global jihadism.
And in 2008, you said at the Brookings Institution that this is the strategic defeat of al-Qaeda. We're seeing the end of it.
Strategic, no, what I said was the strategic defeat of al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Yes.
In Iraq.
Yes, in Iraq. We're talking about Iraq.
And I actually would stand by that statement at that time.
And 5 years later, General?
And 5 years later,
they are occupying Fallujah.
It's certainly a great disappointment, but it might be caused by an inconsistency.
General, is an understatement.
Marwan, let me finish.
Let
me finish. By inconsistency in American policy. Now, you may make the claim that this got generated by the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, but it is true to say in 2008, and I don't think it's a challengeable sentence, that al-Qaeda in Iraq was facing strategic defeat. Now, what happened after 2008 was the decision of my government that the right number of American troops to remain in Iraq was 0.
So you think the problem is not that America got in, it's the problem that America got out?
I actually think that if there had been a continued American troop presence in Iraq, and not massive numbers, 7, 8, 12,000, with the right kind of people, the right kind of equipment, training, logistics, counterterrorism, intelligence, especially intelligence, that the Iraqis would have been far more able to prevent the resurgence of al-Qaeda.
There's something conspicuous, General, that al-Qaeda is running amok in Iraq and Syria, and maybe now in Lebanon, right? Its affiliates all over the place, actually occupying cities. While America is going after them in the hills of Afghanistan, Pakistan, they're going after them in Somalia, in Libya, in Africa, throughout. Why is America so quiet about al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria today?
You know, we did carry it out in Iraq, but with the absence of American forces, we can no longer do that. And we have actually...
You don't have American forces in Yemen. You don't have American forces in Pakistan.
And we don't have... but we
You're
also,
violating the airspace and the sovereignty
have the political circumstances in those other countries where we can act. We do not have the political circumstances in Iraq, although one of the decisions made by our government at the request of Iraq was to give the Iraqis Hellfire missiles, the very missiles that are used in the American targeted killing program.
Let's talk about that. You actually think supporting a sectarian leader, according to many Iraqis, like al-Maliki, is a solution to extremism?
It is very, very difficult for him to be the kind of leader that history demands.
So you're actually supporting a leader who's not inclusive, who's not a Democrat, who's not a national leader, but a sectarian leader, in order to fight extremism.
Well,
it sounds like
look,
it sounds like a trap.
One should not make the argument that we are the controlling authority as to who constitutes the government of Iraq. I mean, frankly,
I haven't even heard conditions that something say, you know what, you have to bring those parliamentarians back into parliament.
Or maybe
you have to be inclusive. Nothing.
Maybe ease the death penalty on your vice president.
For example.
Things like that. Yeah.
Nothing.
Well, actually, you've got Senator Menendez of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the U.S. Senate actually demanding that as a precondition for any increased assistance to Iraq.
Once again, the voice is coming from Congress, not from the administration.
Well, I am part of neither body of government.
The core of al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat. Our nation is more secure. And our homeland is safer.
In short, we are achieving our objectives.
The words were carefully scripted and highly deliberative, and perhaps imprudent and naive.
We won the war and lost the peace. I blame Obama and Biden. Now you see al-Qaeda on the rise.
The grim reality is that al-Qaeda is on the rise throughout the Middle East and North Africa.
A rise so alarming, it forced President Obama to admit.
What we've seen is the emergence of various al-Qaeda affiliates, from Yemen to Iraq, from Somalia to North Africa. The threat today is more diffuse, with al-Qaeda's affiliates in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, the most active in plotting against our homeland. Unrest in the Arab world has also allowed extremists to gain a foothold in countries like Libya and Syria.
My view of the Arab Spring was that it was, in a perverse sense, God's gift to al-Qaeda.
Or is al-Qaeda the gift that keeps on giving exoneration and excuse for dictators and warmongers alike?
You look now and throughout the region, Middle East, Africa, Asia, you see al-Qaeda proliferating almost everywhere. You think that there are different types of al-Qaeda, the ones who are hostile to the United States, the ones who are not so hostile to the United States. Can we recognize that this is an American failure, that the war on al-Qaeda has failed?
Well, let's parse that claim out along several levels. In terms of the immediate war, the war that we're always really good at, the actual combat, taking care of those people who are already convinced they want to come and do us harm, we've actually been remarkably successful.
Without due process?
We have due process.
Violating the sovereignties of other countries?
Due process in a war? I mean, look, our Constitution is quite clear. All right? Due process is something that we give inside our internal judicial system, and it's something we give to American citizens. Now, you're going to mention Anwar al-Awlaki, and you're going to say, well, did you give that American citizen due process? And my answer would be, yes, we did. It wasn't judicial due process, but it was due process.
His son also.
Yeah, his son was not the intended victim of the strike.
A lot of unintended victims.
No, actually,
what do you call here in the city collateral damage?
We do, and it's actually
thousands of innocents.
No.
Dead.
Absolutely not. And if we're talking about the targeted killing program, it's quite small and actually a remarkable testimony to the precision that the American Armed Forces have used.
Assassinating people overseas.
Assassinating is a narrowly defined legal term. Targeted killings of members of an armed opposing enemy force during a state of war between the United States and al-Qaeda.
Be that as it may, General, it failed, correct? It didn't deter.
No, the
al-Qaeda is proliferating, and as you called it, a lot of groups now think it's panache to be called al-Qaeda. It's becoming fashionable.
Well, you certainly love the brand out there for some groups.
Well, you're certainly not deterring people. Yeah. We know that. So why continue to use the same policy, bang your head against the same wall, knowing that the result is the same? Al-Qaeda is proliferating. Maybe there should be different solutions.
All right, Marwan, we need to parse this out. There are certain tasks that needed to be done. Some of them we've done very well. Others we've not done well.
Which are the ones that you haven't done well?
Some we've not done at all. All right? What we've done well is to take care of that immediate band trying to kill us. All right?
I like the failures.
In American military thought, all right, we divide any conflict into what we call the close fight and the deep fight. In this war, the close fight is taking care of those people already convinced they want to come kill us. The deep fight deals with the production rate of those people who may want to come kill us in 1, 3, 5, or 7 years. Very successful here, not nearly as successful here. That's a much more complicated struggle for us. And we have not nearly done as much as we should have done with regard to that.
Is this your complicated way of saying we failed?
No, it's my complicated way of saying we've got more work to do.
But it's been 10 years, 12 years. And during that time, we've said so many times, we killed the second in command and we killed the second in command. We took care of that. Occupied one country, occupied another, violating the airspace and the sovereignty of this country and the other country.
I would choose different words, but
we have a whole industry here. The intelligence industry, the outsourcing, you know the whole bit. The surveillance program that you are the godfather of in this country, that many in this country find unconstitutional and so on and so forth. And the end result is what? The proliferation of al-Qaeda.
The end result is no successful externally based attack on the United States by al-Qaeda since 9/11. Check. That's really important. Al-Qaeda has proliferated. The Economist magazine back in September, October, stated something I believe to be very true. All right? Al-Qaeda is weaker, much weaker than it was on 9/11. But it's also true that al-Qaeda controls more territory and has more adherents today than at any other time in its history. That's certainly true as well.
Can we agree that the main victims for al-Qaeda might not be Americans and Westerners, but certainly the main victims of al-Qaeda over the last 12 years have been Arabs and Muslims?
Absolutely true.
So it's okay. It's okay if al-Qaeda proliferates out there.
No, it's not okay. But look, the solution to this deep fight, the close fight, Americans can't quite handle on our own, but we can do a larger proportion of that on our own. This deep fight, it's not totally something we can't influence, but we're not the prime mover there. That requires other things to happen. Let's move on. Let's move on to Egypt. All right, and what happened there, and the Muslim Brotherhood. My last visit, one of my last visits as director, was to Cairo, and I sat there across the table from President Mubarak, and I sat there. Not unlike our conversation today, where he was throwing tough questions at me, and all those tough questions were about the lack of American understanding of Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, and all of this American pressure on him to be more inclusive and to be more democratic was a complete misreading of the situation. Well, actually, I think he got it wrong. I think we actually had a better understanding of the truth than he did. And we had a dramatic democratic revolution in Egypt, but because no other of the democratic forces were well organized, the Muslim Brotherhood came into power. Now look, Marwan, that's a very complicated situation.
But your man throughout, your interlocutor, the one, as you said it, you had a lot of time for, was Omar Slimane.
Omar, yes, of course.
Is that why you got it wrong in Egypt?
No,
you couldn't predict it?
We got it right in Egypt.
Because that was your contact?
We're the ones warning him that this cannot go on forever.
But you didn't predict that this was going to happen.
Oh, look, this was almost spontaneous combustion. Who on earth could predict there would be 1 million people in Tahrir Square 4 weeks after a Tunisian fruit merchant self-immolates in a mid-sized Tunisian city? That's an unpredictable series of events.
What about everything else you missed, from 9/11 to the rise of al-Qaeda again in Iraq and Syria? You know, we can go back to the 1973 war, to the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the undoing of the Soviet Union. You really got it wrong, General, on so many issues the last half a century.
We get some things right, Marwan.
But you've got a lot of important things wrong.
Okay, so you're saying I should have predicted Tahrir Square, right?
So the Brotherhood has been banned in Egypt, outlawed as a terrorist organization. If you call a political group like the Brotherhood terrorists, what message does that send to the young people in the Arab world for America not to be working with the new regime in Egypt?
Yeah, my sense is that if you label the Brotherhood as terrorists, you stand a very good chance of making them terrorists. And that's not a wise decision, I believe, on the part of the Sisi government in Egypt.
But this administration is working with the Sisi leadership.
You know, life's hard, life's full of hard choices. And with whom else do you propose we work in Egypt other than the current government?
How about putting pressure on them? Ultimatums, conditions, severing support, severing any corporation. What happened?
I'm out of government, all right?
On that sobering note, General, we're going to have to end, and we're going to come back and discuss the subject of Egypt in our second half. But thank you for joining us.
In a sense, Mubarak was right that if I fall, we're going to have the proliferation of the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam, and that's exactly what happened.
It is al-Qaeda now, narrative that is winning now, because now the change through the ballot box didn't, last.
I think there is a very strong determination not to get involved in another conflict, not to put boots on the ground and so on.
Mohammed Morsi, the first Egyptian president to come to power through election. Indeed, the first Egyptian president to be truly elected. A member of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that has been outlawed again and again since its creation in 1928. It was a time of triumph. In the parliamentary elections that had come before Morsi's ascent to the presidency, over 69% of the vote went to the Muslim Brotherhood and allied Islamist parties. President Morsi got an honorary doctorate from the National University of Science and Technology in Pakistan. Some people may have joked about it. But whose laugh was it when Morsi removed the generals who had suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood under Mubarak and replaced them with his own man, General Sisi? In the only other election since the start of the Arab Spring, another Islamic party, the Al-Nahda movement, had come to power, winning a plurality in Tunisia. Political Islam looked to be the wave that would sweep over the whole region.
They have been the most organized opposition movement.
They are now within the political arena and playing the democratic game.
But in fact, political Islam had already reached its high water mark. The tide was about to sweep back out. Resistance to Morsi and to an Islamic government began to grow. July 1st, 2013, General Sisi, Morsi's own man, issues an ultimatum. 2 days later, General Sisi had the army remove Morsi and took over the government in the name of the people and of the army. Political Islam had risen to the pinnacle of power in Egypt. That power lasted just 14 months. In only a year and a half, the Muslim Brotherhood had fallen from being leaders of their nation to outlaws, once again on the run. To discuss the impact of this and more, we are joined by Khalil Anani from the Middle East Institute here in Washington, and author of several books on Islamic movements, including his forthcoming book, Unpacking the Muslim Brotherhood, Religion, Identity, and Politics. And Marina Ottaway from the Woodrow Wilson Center, who writes regularly on political transformations in the Middle East. Her most recent publication is Yemen on the Brink. And Bob Dreyfus, an investigative journalist who specializes in national security issues, contributing editor to The Nation magazine and author of several books, including Devil's Game, How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamentalist Islam. So, Marina, gentlemen, welcome to Empire. It seems here in Washington, the atmosphere is almost cool and collected when it comes to the deterioration of the situation in Egypt.
The fact is the United States has very little leverage over Egypt and very little control over what happens there. And I think we were caught by surprise at the beginning, 3 years ago. And I think ever since then, it's been kind of a comedy of errors because...
So you don't think they're just satisfied with the change, with outlawing the Brotherhood?
No, I think really the goal would be stability. I mean, when the Brotherhood was in power, we didn't have the administration denouncing the Muslim Brotherhood. They were working with them. I think they expected, like many people, that the Brotherhood and the military had kind of a deal behind the scenes to share power. And
that didn't happen.
That alliance fell apart. And so the resulting thing for the United States is they were shocked and surprised, and I don't think they've still yet figured out exactly how to handle it.
Well, the United States was not exactly destroyed to see the Muslim Brotherhood pushed out of power. It was never the first choice. It would not have been the choice of the administration to have the Muslim Brothers win the elections.
But Marina, they weren't voted out. They were outlawed and decreed as terrorists.
Yes. No, but yes, I totally agree with that. But that was still the United States was not sorry to see them pushed aside. And the tendency has been, as for the same reason they accepted the Muslim Brotherhood, the U.S. decided to go with the flow.
The thing is that the lack of consistency in the American foreign policy towards Egypt, that makes the problem. I mean, at the time that they did not call what happened on July 3rd as a coup, they acted as a coup. So this gap between the principles and the interests, which is used to be the predicament of the American foreign policy, was very visible in the Egyptian case.
Bob, there is leverage.
They called it a coup or not a coup. I think that was a technical issue involving the legal aspects of American aid. But I think everybody in the United States...
has political implications, Bob. I mean, yes, it's technical, but it has political implications.
But I don't think...
It gives the sign to the military that, I mean, that's fine, you can get rid of a democratically and a freely elected president, and you can go ahead.
But is there or is there no leverage for America on the Egyptian leadership today?
No, I don't think the U.S. has any leverage at this point, or very little, because there is nothing... First of all, the U.S. is not a player from an economic point of view. Whether the U.S. provides aid or does not provide aid is largely irrelevant at this point, except symbolically.
But does the Obama administration see the outlawing of the Brotherhood as a major crisis that will lead to further radicalization in the region, Marina?
They keep talking about the necessity of inclusion, but what we are discovering, not just in Egypt, in the region more generally, the U.S. has enormous power in the sense that it has a military that is unmatched by the military of any country. That does not mean that it has a lot of influence, so that either it uses the military to impose something on a country, or if it tries to use the power of persuasions, I think, it has very little.
There's a good segment of the population, Bob, is trying to forget about the Middle East. They want to pull out. They don't want to think about it.
I think there is a sense of war weariness. I think there's a sense that the Middle East is too complicated. It's Sunnis and Shias, and we don't really know what they stand for. And it's all these countries like Saudi Arabia that we don't. It's too complicated. So let's not think about it anymore, and let's focus at home.
The question is, at the time that we hear this kind of rhetoric about disengagement and withdrawal from the Middle East, if you look at the practical side, no, there is a heavy involvement of the United States in there. They are in the Gulf. They are playing a very important role in this Iranian-Western deal. They are sponsoring or playing a very important role in the Syrian conflict. They are, there is some kind of contradiction between what they really want to do and what they are doing
And certainly when you bring up the questions of al-Qaeda and you see them holding the flags in Iraq and Syria and in the Sinai, you would have to say something about it, right, in Washington?
Yes.
You can't ignore it.
Obviously, you cannot ignore the presence of al-Qaeda. The problem is, again, short of a military intervention, the United States has little leverage in the area. Take the example of Iraq. I think the policies of Prime Minister al-Maliki have certainly made the situation much worse in terms of alienating the Sunni population. There is nothing the United States can do to get Maliki to change his position.
Let's talk about that. It seems that there is this other approach in America, this other school, if you will, that says, look, we've sacrificed, our children died in Iraq, and we've invested hugely there, and still al-Qaeda is back, the Middle East is unfolding. There is no point of getting involved. Those people in the Middle East do not want what we want.
I don't think that's true. I think that the narrative really to focus on is that al-Qaeda has been essentially decimated and destroyed as a threat to the United States. I don't think there's a great and panicky concern that we're about to be attacked by terrorists again. Now, does that mean what's happening in the Middle East isn't chaotic and horrible? Of course it does. But from the standpoint of the United States, the real operating narrative, and this is something that the Republicans tried to overturn over Benghazi when they started waving the bloody flag of the ambassador's murder there and saying, oh, Mr. Obama, you ignored al-Qaeda. Now we know that wasn't even al-Qaeda that attacked the American diplomatic facility.
But Bob,
so al-Qaeda does not exist. Osama bin Laden
al-Qaeda does not exist?
No, it barely exists as an organization. Its leader is dead. Its leadership is fragmented. It's unable to mount a serious attack on the United States. And the gangs that are tromping all over Syria and Iraq and North Africa are not al-Qaeda of 2001.
Al-Qaeda Central.
They are not
al-Qaeda of Afghanistan.
I have to disagree with Bob. I mean, with my respect to what he said, indeed, I would say the flip side of the failure of the Arab Spring is the rise of al-Qaeda. At the time that there is no much progress when it comes to democracy and human rights and the freedoms, there is a rise in al-Qaeda, whether in Islamic Maghreb, whether in for Syria, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. You have al-Qaeda at Arab Peninsula, you have al-Qaeda at East Africa, you have al-Qaeda, the motherland, in Pakistan, Afghanistan. So I think there is a very strong link between the failure of the Arab Spring and for the fall of many democratic, I would say, or elected governments, and between the rise of al-Qaeda. It used to be that there are two contested narratives. The one is that the only way to change is through the ballot box, through democracy. Another one is through force.
And now with
Egypt? Now it is al-Qaeda now, narrative is that is winning now, because now the change through the ballot box didn't, last, or don't continue.
So we're probably going to see more radicalization of Arab and Muslim youth.
I feel to call them all al-Qaeda, I think it's almost assuming that there is an organization, that there are connections that may be much stronger than they actually are.
But they call themselves al-Qaeda.
No, I think al-Qaeda is dead. And if it isn't dead, it's a dying organization. No. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of people that want to kill other people that they disagree with on religious and other grounds, political grounds. But that's not the same as al-Qaeda. I mean, in a sense, Mubarak was right that if I fall, we're going to have the proliferation of the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam, and that's exactly what happened. That's what's happening in Syria. That's what happened in Iraq when we knocked off Saddam Hussein and created a political vacuum. So these Islamist groups are dangerous. They're fueled by outside.
Bob. I mean, there are two things. The first one is al-Qaeda. I mean, it's not only an organization or a structure. It's merely an idea, an ideology, and that people can just pick it out from the air. That only way to change is to use force, and the other way is that through the ballot box. Now, what's happening is that with this kind of crackdown against moderate Islamists, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, and with this kind of exclusion from the political game, you are giving al-Qaeda ideology, al-Qaeda, I would say, argument in power that can, get minds and hearts of young Muslims.
But the crackdown started under Mubarak. He suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood. That didn't create al-Qaeda in Egypt. The crackdown does not create al-Qaeda, but Islam as a force is a different thing than al-Qaeda. Now, who is General Hayden targeting with drones?
Egypt witnessed the rise of radical and violent Islams over the last 3 decades because the repression and exclusion from the political regime.
Can we agree that the exclusion of moderate Islamists who want to join the ballot box leads to further radicalization and violent Islamism?
I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood itself, as the organization with the structure and so on, is going to turn to violence. But I think what's going to happen is that younger people who have turned to the Muslim Brotherhood would turn towards
like that we've seen in the 70s.
Groups.
Yes, exactly.
After the crackdown in the 1960s.
I still don't want to call them al-Qaeda because I think we really, because I think it's too simple. Al-Qaeda, it's a convenient label, both for the radical groups and for the government.
If there are 3 trends in historically over the last several decades of reformist Islam, conservative Islam, and violent Islamism, certainly the latter one is the one that's getting currency after the counter-revolutions in the Arab world.
Sure. Well, I think the reformist trend is still there. The conservative and reformist is still there.
Definitely.
The one that is getting all the attention, of course, is the violent one, because that's the one we worry about.
You think it's a question of attention, then?
Look, I'm convinced from what I hear, from what I see, that the Muslim Brotherhood, as the moderate organization that it was, still exists. It has gone underground. No, but I'm saying that presence is still, that trend is still very much there. It's still dominating in Tunisia, the Islamist trend that's dominating in Morocco. The ones that are getting all the attention are the violent ones because they are the most dangerous, and they are the ones we are afraid that they will grow.
I guess you agree with that, Bob. That's one falling tree makes more noise than an entire growing jungle.
Well, violence develops attention, of course. But
and it could be easily exploited by those, whether they are dictators or warmongers.
The game used to be that these dictator regimes used to, to benefit from this kind of radical movements in order to shift the discourse from freedoms and democracy to fighting terrorism. And this used to be the case even in Egypt. Now it is the case in Syria. I mean, look at the beginning of the Syrian revolution. It was very peaceful, but Bashar, smartly could change the discourse and change the game from calling for freedom and for human rights and democracy to fighting terrorism. Now the same thing in Egypt right now. Now, one of the smartest things that Sisi did in last July, that he changed the whole discourse in Egypt and the whole debate from democracy, freedoms and human rights into fighting terrorism and maintaining security. And this is the game.
And here where the United States perhaps has a third school that still thinks it can effect change in the Middle East, whether through direct intervention or through outsourcing. But let's watch this report first, and then we'll come back and discuss it.
The United States, I think, is particularly resistant, to learning lessons from hard-won experience.
The 5 biggest recipients of U.S. aid are Israel, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Egypt. It's to fight terrorism. It's to bring freedom and democracy and stability to the region. In return, Israel gives orders to American politicians.
Israel is what is right about the Middle East. that with big parts of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States being against it, the country of Israel being against it, that's a stiff hill to climb.
Oh, well, that makes sense. The senators from the great state of Israel are against it, and we don't want to go against the senators from the great state. Wait a minute, that's not in our country.
What we face in Afghanistan is a triangle of terror. And this triangle comprises of the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and the ISI of Pakistan.
It wouldn't be such a big deal, really, if Iraqi politics hadn't been handled in the way they have been by Nouri al-Maliki, whose disregard for Sunni equities has been striking.
As for Egypt,
the United States should not be supporting this coup.
When the Obama administration made moves in that direction, the reaction was swift. Saudi Arabia, along with Kuwait and the UAE, stepped up with almost 10 times the amount of all U.S. aid. In Egypt, it made General Sisi even more popular. Then the U.S. Congress came up with a law that would keep the money flowing to Egypt. Over the last 3 decades, Washington has poured billions of dollars into these countries in the search of stability. And the result, 4 of the 5 are extremely corrupt. And those 4 are at the top of the index of failed states, while the 5th, Israel, presides over another failed state in the occupied Palestinian territories. As America faces the future, will it learn from the lessons of the past?
For the 10 years after 9/11, intervention was just colossal. It was an enormous investment, an enormous cost that did not bear fruit.
But what are those lessons?
So, Marina, they're not getting involved on the ground, boots on the ground, but certainly outsourcing a lot of the American influence to dictators now with the change of the law to support Sisi, also Maliki. How does that play out in the end?
I don't think it's a conscious policy of outsourcing to these people. I think, very frankly, the administration does not know which way to jump right now, because I think there is a very strong determination not to get involved in another conflict, not to put boots on the ground and so on. And there is really no good policy to replace it. Look what we have done in Syria. We have provided small amount of non-lethal assistance to groups that have never been able to fight.
When you change a law in the United States to support Sisi with another $1.5 billion, when you support the military in Pakistan, when you support al-Maliki, who's considered to be a sectarian leader by many Iraqis, that's certainly outsourcing American foreign policy to autocrats.
No, I think we simply do not know what to do, and we accept these autocrats because we don't have any alternatives.
And they're there.
And they are there.
I mean,
exactly.
Look, we tried to put boots on the ground in Iraq, and they kicked us out. We said, we want to keep 5,000 or 10,000 troops there, and Maliki said, no, you may leave. We tried to keep, now we're trying to keep troops in Afghanistan, and Karzai said, no, we don't want you. The idea that we are controlling these events is just wrong. The Pakistanis, yes, we support the military, and but we've long seen the Pakistani military as the main supporters of the Taliban, and we've been extremely frustrated about that and have been unable to...
But as the main, as Obama calls it, the world-only superpower, with such a great influence in the region, certainly it's failing in exercising a constructive role in the region.
One of the consequences of the heavy legacy of Bush administration, that they left no space for Obama to exert any role in what's happening right now. That's why you can find this kind of self-disengagement from what's happening there. The question is to what extent this can backfire in the future in the United States. In other words, if you look at, let's say, in Egypt, for instance, and how people look at the Americans there, I mean, you can find that the United States is blamed from all sides there. I mean, they could not satisfy anyone. That's why, because they did not stick to their principles that they used to talk about, human rights, democratization, freedoms. And what happened is that once the balance of power changed or shifted in a certain direction, they just go with it. They always play with the winner horse.
The default position of U.S. policy in the Middle East has always been to support the regime that's there. We are doing it in the Gulf.
Where do you see then now President Obama?
Well, there's been several phases, right, of Obama. At first, you remember when he ran for office, he was against Iraq, but Afghanistan was the good war. And so when he came in, he escalated in Afghanistan. But I think in the back of his mind, and now Bob Gates tells us this in his book, that Obama really didn't have his heart in that.
Didn't have a passion for it.
Right, which is true, I believe. I believe. And then the second fallback position for Obama was, well, if we're not going to go invading all these countries, but we still have to fight terrorism, we're going to use drones. And there were hundreds of drone strikes in 2009. But it's been dropping very rapidly since then. Every year it's been dropped by about half. So the drone strikes are now beginning to fade off the picture.
As well.
And of course, drones, you know, they create terrorists for every strike.
It seems, Marina, it seems that President Obama agrees with Bob. I don't know how you would take that, but certainly agrees on on his analysis of the Al-Qaeda and its proliferation. The president thinks that not everyone called Osama is a danger to the United States, and not every group that calls itself Al-Qaeda is a danger to the United States. Hence, Obama doesn't feel the necessity to intervene in the Middle East any more than he did before.
I don't think that it's quite that clear cut. I think my perception is that the Obama administration cannot make up its mind which way it wants to go. So that yes, it's thinking about, no, but yes, drone strikes are continuing because after all you have to keep these groups in check. We make, we make statements about how Egypt is, and as Secretary Kerry did last November in Egypt, the military regime is beginning to move back towards democracy, and therefore we pat them on the back because democracy is still important and so on. We are all over the place.
I think there is a tendency and perception among American officials that their hands are tied and they don't have, many options in how to deal with each case by case in the region. Until now, we cannot talk about a coherent strategy on how to deal with this kind of unfolding events in the Middle East.
Khalil, on that note, sobering note, I must once again, Bob, Marina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'll be back with the final thoughts. The chaos, instability, and violence that have engulfed the Middle East region might have been beneficial to extremists, but they've certainly been devastating to journalists. Paradoxically, as the media become ever more influential in the age of technological revolution, its foot soldiers, the journalists, have been ever more exposed. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 2012 and 2013 had been the worst on record. Last year, 211 have been imprisoned and 100 journalists have been killed. That's almost 2 a week. The worst on record are Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, those that we've just discussed. Of course, Al Jazeera is at the heart of it all. Already a few of our colleagues were killed, and today 5 of our colleagues sit in Egyptian prisons. Well, it's ironic that the only thing in common among warmongers, dictators, and Al-Qaeda affiliates is targeting journalists. Perhaps it's time for us journalists also to stand united in response. And that's the way it goes. Write to me with your suggestions. Until next time.